Ron Nevison.
Hey.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay.
You've given us so much great music over the years. Growing up, who were your heroes? Who inspired you to want to make music and really get behind the board?
I was a singer in a band. It was like a doo-wop band, but I wasn't the lead singer, but I did backgrounds and I learned a lot about singing. But even before that, I was a soloist at the Temple University Boys Choir when I was a child, from like 8 to 12. And I learned a lot of, I used to sing Mozart. And, learned a lot about singing from that. It was a Saturday kind of thing. So I graduated from that into bands and worked my way into the music business by way of mixing live sound in the 60s, the late 60s, and then going into the studio in England in the 70s.
What was the big break? What was the one job that really led to the door?
My first big job was I was the engineer on the Quadrophenia album for The Who. That was the first big album I did.
How did that come about?
It came about because I had joined a company called Track Plan that was making studios for musicians that Pete Townsend owned. And they commissioned me to do a mobile studio, or mobile, as they say in England, for Ronnie Lane of the Faces, who was a very close friend of Pete's.
Yeah.
They had this Mayor Baba spiritual kind of connection. And so I built this mobile studio in an Airstream trailer that Ronnie Lane had bought. And Pete was doing his own studio for The Who to do the Quadrophenia album. And this control room wasn't finished, but the studio part was finished. So he called up Ronnie and said, hey, can we use your mobile studio as the control room, you know, we need to start working. So I guess I just fell into that, because who better than the guy that built it to run it? And of course, if I didn't do a good job on the first few days, I would have been tossed out, but they kept me for a few years.
Wow.
So, because I did the Tommy film soundtrack after that.
Yeah.
So that was a break, of course, but you know, I was at the right place at the right time, and I did a great job on the studio. And I mean, I used that studio for Zeppelin and for Bad Company and lots of things. We did a lot of mobile recording in those days, renting houses and just going out in the country. And you know, I did actually the first 3 Bad Company albums in mobile studios.
So it brought you into that inner circle. Tell us about working with Zeppelin.
Well, I only did the first half. Actually, I did the newer tracks on Physical Graffiti because I didn't know, I had moved on. Zeppelin had a habit of using engineers at one place and then changing engineers, whereas with The Who, I did everything. I recorded all the stuff, I mixed it with Pete. You know. With Zeppelin, once we moved out of the mobile tracking and overdub phase, and they moved into Olympic Studios, they used a guy at Olympic. I also had an obligation to do the Tommy film, which was a year project with Pete. So I didn't know that they were going to go back to the previous album, which is Houses of the Holy, and do use all those tracks. In other words, I didn't know it was going to be a double album until it came out. So, but I did some of the good stuff like Kashmir, and you know, My Time of Dying, and Sick Again, Wanton's Song. You know, it's all part of my history.
Yeah, very exciting. Now talk about Bad Company. Obviously, Paul Rodgers, to me, his voice is as strong or stronger now than
isn't that
it's
amazing?
ever been. How does that work?
I totally agree, you know.
I mean, talk about the magic that they made.
You know, well, it was the Paul Rodgers band originally when I started with them. And they didn't have a name, and the record company, Swan Song, was pressing them for a name once we were finishing up the album. And they just used the name of the song Bad Company, because they thought, well, in America, bad's good. You know, when you're bad, you know, you're good.
Yeah.
And so that's how the name, they used that song, which Paul had written. The lyrics to, no, I think he wrote the whole song. You know, him and Mick had a lot of songs from their previous groups that weren't appropriate. you know, Mick had a lot of stuff from Mott the Hoople, and Paul had a lot of stuff from Free.
Yeah.
And so when they got together, they had a lot of good material.
Amazing records. So this was
You know,
the Bad Company,
I know you're
Straight
touching on this,
Shooter.
but my really, you know, I started producing in 1975, and you know, produced lots of acts. You're really just touching on a very small part of my career, even though
it's a massive list.
Even though they are, you know, very important albums to my career.
Sure.
I wasn't a royalty artist on those albums. I was like paid $100 a week.
Wow.
But people said, you didn't make money on that? I said, yeah, I did, really. You know, when I came back to the U.S. in 1975 with those kind of credentials tucked under my arm, you know, the doors open wide open for me.
Ozzy Comes Calling,
Ozzy,
UFO,
Kiss,
everybody.
UFO, Babies.
Yeah.
Chicago, Heart.
Yeah. Rolling Stones. So you recorded the live
Love You Live.
Love You Live album.
Yes, I did. Not all of it, but I recorded the West Coast and Midwest dates, and they used the record plant mobile truck, and then the East Coast they used the record plant East Coast mobile truck with a different guy. So I recorded a lot of it. I mean, maybe 15 shows or something like that. From Chicago to LA to San Francisco to other places.
Sure. So many great records. Obviously, you've done a few with UFO. I mean, the Lights Out album was phenomenal. Obsession.
Yeah.
Talk about, you know, the chemistry in that band. I know, I guess Michael Schenker left the group during that period.
Michael left. I did 3 albums, and he left right after the 3rd album, which is a live double album called Strangers in the Night.
Sure.
In fact, I was mixing that album at the record plant in LA, and there's a French restaurant next door, and all of a sudden, doobie doobie doo, you know, Frank Sinatra came on with Stranger in the Night, and I just thought, you know, what a cool name for UFO's album, Strangers in the Night. And they liked it, and Chrysalis liked it, and so that's how that happened.
Yeah. Certainly one of their prime periods there.
Yeah, and Schenker had a problem with them, but he went off with the Moonies at some point. I mean, he was a handful. And he was a brilliant writer, but I mean, really came up with some amazing pieces of music. The problem is he didn't write with the rest of the band, so he didn't write from a vocalist standpoint. So I had to rearrange a lot of his music, to make verses and choruses, and he had a lot of thematic stuff, themes. I tried to encourage him to write more with Phil Mogg, the singer, so that there would be places for words. And so it was, I wouldn't say a struggle, but it was, you know, it was something that, you know, he wrote such good stuff that it's hard to, and he played like no one else in the world.
Sure.
So, I mean, it was a great experience. I did the 2, you know, Obsession and Lights Out, and then I did the Strangers in the Night live album.
Sure.
And then later, I did another UFO album 10 years later called Walk on Water, I think. And then I did 2 MSG albums with Michael, with his Michael Schenker group. So altogether, I did lots of, I don't know, 6 albums with most of those guys.
Yeah. We'll talk about working with Kiss, because I know they were obviously very established, very veteran at the time.
Right.
You know, what was the chemistry like that working with them? Were they open ideas, or did they have a definite way of meeting it?
You know, Gene sent me 25 songs. Paul sent me like 6. Gene just sent me everything. You know, Paul was very particular about it. Paul, you know, took the stuff that wasn't really good out. And sent me the good stuff, and he had co-written some songs with people, and his songs were great. And traditionally, Paul wrote most of the stuff and sang most of the stuff, and Gene had a couple of songs. So that's what we did with this record. And you know, you have to remember it was the year '87 when the Crazy Nights album, and they wanted to go bigger than they had gone, and they had the, you know, and they needed singles to do that. And so I pushed them. There was contemporary hit radio in those days, CHR, And, you know, it was hard to get a Kiss record on contemporary hit radio. Yeah. And so I had to soften it up a little bit, and I took a little heat for some of those things. You know, it wasn't, you know, yeah. But I think it's a great album. I listen back to some stuff and I go, well, maybe I could have mixed that better. Maybe I could have used a little more guitars and less synth. But synth was so big in those days, in the 80s. And you have to remember, it was done when it was done. And that's what the sound that was happening then.
Yeah. Now, was this around the time of the Heart?
This is 87.
Period?
This is a couple
before Heart?
Well, I did 84, 85. 85 was the Heart album that I did with These Dreams and What About Love.
So did that album possibly open that door to Kiss wanting to
maybe so.
Grab some of that?
Yeah, maybe so. And then
Such
I did the Bad Animals album, which had another #1 hit with Alone on the, it's called Bad Animals.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was in that kind of, you know, and I had done an album with Ozzy and also had one of his first hit singles ever.
And this is with Jakey Lee?
Yes, it was with Jakey Lee.
Okay,
right.
the Original Sin. Ultimate Sin, that's right.
I did that in London in summer of 85.
And what was it like working with Ozzy? You know, the chemistry or the
you
give
know,
and take?
The only problem I had with Ozzy was that when it came down to do his vocals, he wasn't turning up. He was like at home. So I said to Sharon, I think I need to go somewhere, me and Ozzy, somewhere to do the vocals, so he's not at home. So I'll have him a trapped guy. So
right.
I'll have
take him out of his element.
She said, well, take him to France. He doesn't like the French at all. So Ozzy, myself, and one of the roadies, the three of us went to Paris, found a studio, and he was so bored that in 10 days we had finished the vocals. But he was, I mean, otherwise he was great. I mean, he's a funny guy. He's great to be around. He's a real character, as you've got to know, as everybody's got to know him.
He's a big kid.
And he's a big parted guy, funny. You know, it was a very fun project. You know? I don't mean to demean him at all by the fact that he didn't turn up. Maybe he was a little scared to do his vocals. I don't know. But anyway, we got him done, and it all worked out. And the Shot in the Dark single that we did, you know, opened. And then Sharon said to me, you know, well, where's the next one? I said, well, you wouldn't let me do any more songs like this. You know, I didn't have a follow-up, you know. So there's a lesson there, you know.
That's great. So many great records by so many amazing bands. I see you've done a few with Chicago. What was it like working with them?
Yeah, well, I wasn't sure I was the right guy for Chicago, but you know, the Howard Kaufman, Trudy Green guys who managed Heart, you know, said that, you know, they would like to talk to me, and I ended up doing 3 songs with them in Chicago 19. And all 3 songs ended up being big hits. The only 3, I think, on the album that were hits, you know, one was a #1 called Look Away, a Diane Warren song. And so that was Chicago 19. And so when it came to the next album, actually 20 was a greatest hits album. It wasn't called 20. So the next 21, I decided, well, I really like working with them. You know, I'll do the whole album, which I did. It wasn't quite as successful as 19, but you know, it was still pretty successful. And so I enjoyed working with them. So I did the 1.5 albums, I guess you could say.
And you've done a couple great records with the Babies. With
well,
John
the Babies
Waite
back in that was in the 70s. Yeah, they had done their debut album with, gosh, I can't remember his name, a producer from Canada. I don't know why I can't remember his name.
Okay.
And I found a couple of songs for them on the next 2 albums. Their big hits, Isn't It Time on Broken Heart album, and Every Time I Think of You. They didn't really like it. They didn't really like either of the songs, but I was under, you know, Chrysalis.
They thought it was
management.
Too soft, too commercial?
Yeah, a little, yeah. I mean, they had struck out a little bit with the first album. And they wanted to have more single-y kind of stuff, and they were both big hits. And sometimes bands don't like it when you bring in outside stuff, but
Yeah.
the head of Chrysalis and the management said, "This is your mandate. Go do it."
We need popularity to build the rest of the sound on.
The only problem was in those days, Chrysalis had independent distribution, and they really didn't have a lot of records out there. It wasn't until Chrysalis really cranked up with Blondie and Pat Benatar and hooked up with EMI or somebody. I don't remember who it was. I don't remember who it was.
EMI.
Yeah, until they got that kind of distribution, we would have done a lot better on album sales if they had been able to have albums while the singles were happening.
And Thin Lizzy, Phil Lynott?
Thin Lizzy was a fun album to do. I listened back to that. It's one of those albums that I go like, I mixed that album. I mean, his voice was down, the guitars weren't very... I worked in a studio in London that I'd never worked before, and I think I missed the boat on the mix on that. But it was a popular album. It was one of their, best albums.
Sure.
But I enjoyed working with them. Two guitar players and Phil. They're terrific.
Great.
But sometimes I listen back to stuff and I go, wow, that was great. And sometimes I listen back to stuff and I go, did I do that?